Welcome to the Connectfulness Practice Podcast. Here, we settle into the murky, tangled, and freaking hard parts of life to restore our relationship with the self so it can ripple out to the people we love, the work we do, and the world around us. If we can't fix what's wrong, then our grandchildren inherit it. In order to fix what's wrong, we have to talk about it, and we can't move that conversation forward if we're not willing to be real about where we are now. We have to push on the edges of what it means to connect. Otherwise, nothing will ever change. I'm your host, Rebecca Wong, and I'm here to guide you through a series of radically honest conversations about what it means to be truly human in all of its messy, beautiful, hilarious, and heartbreaking glory. In our collective effort of looking inward, we're starting to do the outward work to reconnect the world. While these discussions will guide you into the connectfulness practice, this podcast is not meant to be a substitute for the depth of work that you'd encounter with a licensed provider. If something in this episode touches you, reach out. That's where you initiate the ripple that restores relationships. Learn more about my connectfulness counseling practice and my online workshops at connectfulness.com. Hey there, I'm so excited to share this episode with you. Today I'm joined by Esther Boykin. Esther is a psychotherapist who wants to live in a world where everyone believes that therapy is not a dirty word. Esther is the CEO of Group Therapy Associates, a private practice in the DC metro area, and she works every day to make mental health more accessible, innovative, and culturally relevant for all people. In this episode, Esther and I talk a bit about therapy and about getting to know ourselves and about boundaries. And I think one of the most important things that we can all work on is our own discernment, our own boundary work. And part of the reason it's so important is because the proximity at which we can get to know other people all really relates to how well we know ourselves. And that's what a lot of today's conversation is going to be about. So dig in with us, and I hope that you enjoy the episode. Welcome back, folks. We're here today with Esther Boykin. Esther, welcome, and thank you so much for joining me.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I am a fan of your podcast, so it's lovely to be here today.
This is one of my favorite parts about podcasting is when I get to meet the people that I'm fans of too, and like we get to build these relationships. So it's one of my favorite parts. So you do so many different things. Among them, you have been on podcasts, you have a podcast, you have a group practice. Like there's so many different components of your work. And if we were to summarize a lot of what you do, it's this message that you promote that I think is just a great place for us to start. And that's that therapy is not a dirty word.
Yeah, it's like my favorite thing. It's my favorite thing to say. So,
I'll let you say it.
Okay. Therapy is not a dirty word. And and in my heart, like when I say that and I think about that as kind of, I would probably say that that's the foundation or like the vision behind most of my work.
Yeah.
Is all of the components that make up therapy, right? Like not just therapy, like get a therapist, go to session, but like all the things that we explore are not dirty words. Vulnerability and like authenticity and being with our feelings, owning our story. Like I want all of us to get more and more comfortable with like, these are things that we get to talk about, not just in therapy sessions, but everywhere.
I didn't grow up in a home where all of what you're talking about was okay, which I think is why I am a therapist and why I study things like relational health. But I'm wondering if it was the same for you, or if it was like how did you find your way into like this being this thing that you're so passionate about, I guess is really what my question is.
Yeah. I think not to throw all other therapists in this bucket, but I think that what you just said is true for so many of us, that part of the draw is about recognizing something. And for me, I not to sound super woo-woo with, woo-woo therapist,
woo-woo is welcome.
But for me, it was sort of like that inner knowing, like, I know that this is important. And I will say, I will give my parents credit. Like, I would not say that I grew up in a household that was similar to maybe like what my own kids grew up with, where we talk a lot, vulnerability is a word that they knew and could define. And like, I'm always talking about, how are we feeling and how do we, want to express ourselves. But I also come from, an immigrant family. My parents are both from Jamaica. Anybody who's from a Caribbean family or knows about Caribbean family, like I will give my parents a lot of credit for being farther down the sort of emotional, relational awareness and health being a priority than a lot of their counterparts. Like, I think that was something which I do appreciate. Like, there were shortcomings, but it also, I think, gave me just enough room to be curious and to feel safe about kind of exploring, like, oh, okay, this is a field, this is a career that I could have. And I've always felt like relationships are foundational to the well-being of children, of community, of all of us as a society. And so that's definitely that was my pull to, I didn't know it was pulling me to marriage and family therapy as a specialty. I didn't know that was a specialty until the end of undergrad, but it was always there for me.
It was always there. There were a few things I just heard you say as you were talking about that really kind of like just, I don't know, I got like a warm, fuzzy feeling as I was hearing it. And you were talking about your family and, even in all of the places where it might not have been perfect. I mean, whose family is ever perfect? There's no such thing, right? But I heard you talking about that it was safe for you to be curious and explore.
Yeah. Yeah. I really, both my parents were educators. They worked in higher ed. And so I think that academic curiosity sort of spilled over into, we should be interested in the world, in like learning new things and interested in yourself, that's like a real thing. And so, there are lots of things I look back on now and think as a kid, it didn't seem important to me, but my summer camps were always at like universities, and we went on weird road trips that like we stopped at landmarks and went to museums and things like that sometimes felt boring or ridiculous, like not as fun as everyone else going to like Six Flags, but it did foster a sense of like, oh, the world is interesting. People are interesting.
People are interesting. Yeah. And so that expansiveness that I'm hearing in there, right? Like to me, when I think about relationships, just all relationships between two people or groups of people or whatever, a healthy relationship to me feels more expansive.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And the more kind of collapsed or shut down or frozen we get or avoidant we are, like that's where I think of things not really being relational, not really being connected.
Yeah. Yeah. It's funny. I think a lot of my clients would say, I say often, how can we make more space for that?
Yeah. Yeah. I feel that. I feel that I probably do that too. My clients will probably come back and tell me.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So I want to dive in a little bit more to talking about this idea about therapy not being a dirty word, about all these things that therapy encompasses that I think you and I probably agree with this. It makes us more expansive, healthier humans, people that are more connected and relatable in the world.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I guess that moves us to talking about things like relationships or vulnerability, what it means to be intimate, like emotionally, how we, boundaries.
Boundaries. Always boundaries. Which I think, it's interesting to sort of, I think, talk about boundaries as a starting place for more connectedness.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think so often we come to the conversation or the thought process around boundaries from a place of, oh, I haven't been setting them. So now I need to put up all these walls and fences and tell everyone what to do and how to be around me. And so I think when we come to boundaries from that place, I think it's easy to overlook the fact that boundaries to me are really about creating deeper connection, right? It's about figuring out like, how can I always like boundaries are an invitation.
Mm-hmm.
This is how we can be even closer. I
Yeah.
want to be close to you. And like, this is the way that for me, it would work. And tell me more about what you would need for us to get deeper and closer and more intimate. Not that it's about saying like, oh, don't talk to me, don't do this, don't do that. Let me put up these walls and fences around me, myself and my heart, really.
I love how you put that. And I just want to rewind a little bit and restate what you just said, because it feels really powerful to me, that boundaries are an invitation in terms of how we can get closer.
Yeah.
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 What a like mind shift that is, right? To think of boundaries as invitations for more intimacy as opposed to just walls.
Mm-hmm. And I think, at least for me, it helps to also make sense of why that feels so vulnerable, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because I think sometimes, certainly sometimes I talk to clients and other people, and it feels like, why am I having such a hard time establishing boundaries? Why do I feel anxious about that? Why am I afraid to say it? Because if I care about myself, like these are my values, or like I should be able to
Right, but
say
you
it.
just hit on something really huge there. If I care about myself,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like, why am I having trouble setting boundaries? Often comes back, I think, in my practice, this is what I see in my own life and my
Yeah.
practice, like all of it, right? Is
Mm-hmm.
that I struggle the most, my clients struggle the most to set boundaries when we don't feel our own worth.
Yeah. Yeah. And I see that so often. And I think for me, that shift in perspective helps to bring that a little bit more to the forefront of like, oh, because it's scary, especially when I'm questioning my own value and my worth, to invite someone to be closer to me. And if boundaries are
Mm,
about inviting you to be closer, to love me more, to value me, to respect me, and I'm questioning my own ability to do that for myself, then it's terrifying.
yeah.
And so I think that shift of like, oh, this is about sometimes softening the way we are with each other. That for me, that's also a big part of it is um, sometimes we learn all these things and then, it becomes another way to be hypercritical instead of like softening and being more compassionate with ourselves and saying like, oh, yeah, there are reasons why I'm struggling here to feel
Yeah.
like I deserve this kind of love or connection. And that's okay. Like I can work through that as opposed to, oh, what's wrong with me?
Right. And so what you're leaning into there is something that we started talking about before we started recording, which are these different layers and different ways that we can really listen to ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so it's that those inner questions of like, well, what's happening inside here?
Yeah.
Yeah.
How can we be more curious about our own experiences? And I think for me, it's that sense of curiosity about the layers that, and I will say both personally and with my clients, I feel like when we get to that space, we learn so much more because it's sort of freeing from the judgment around it. I should be this way instead of, I wonder why I'm feeling this, or I wonder why this is coming up, or what is coming up for me that is getting in the way, or that is moving me in a particular direction. Like that openness, that I love the word expansiveness, right? A
Yeah.
more expansive way of being with yourself and ultimately being with others.
Totally.
Yeah.
I'm noticing that like in so many different ways. I think this is also something that we've all been in kind of like lockdown for over a year now, right? In different ways and different kind of
Yeah.
formats. All of us have our own comfort levels and what we're kind of choosing to do around that. But in many ways, we've been less expansive in terms of right who we're with
Yes.
and how we're managing things, and we've been more boundaried in terms of those kinds of things. And so, as we kind of get to this next layer of whatever we're all living through, right? There's
Yeah.
going to be more like collective renegotiations of what am I comfortable with? And I think that really leans into a place where many of us can be exploring like what is okay with me? What do I
Yeah.
want to do? What would feel comfortable for me? And kind of learning to listen to those parts of ourselves.
Mm-hmm. Oh, which is always, I think it's often I won't say it's always, it's often challenging it's okay to listen to yourself first And I think sometimes it's that. It's like we get, and I feel like for a lot of people, or I won't say that, for myself, that's been one of the gifts of this year, has
Yes.
been a reorienting of like, oh, what's comfortable for me first,
Mm-hmm.
and then kind of moving into like, okay, and then where's everybody else? And then, okay, now we can have these conversations about renegotiating boundaries and ways of being with one another. And I think so often we've gotten to a place where we don't listen to us first. It's everyone else, and then you kind of notice where you're maybe resisting or like something feels uncomfortable, or but like, oh, what if we start with us and then share that? And
I think
that's
that
the
changes
invitation.
everything, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's intimacy, because intimacy is like, you've probably heard this, but like, into me I see, right? So
Mhm.
if intimacy is about seeing into the self and then sharing it, that's the vulnerability part of it,
Right.
right? That's the authentic part of it. And so how do I share parts of myself if I don't know who they are?
Exactly. I think that I love that because it gets lost, right? Like we think of intimacy as how can I be closer to other people? And
Mm-hmm.
so our focus is so externally oriented. It's like, but the way to be closer to others is first to get close enough to ourselves. Like you can't get close to me if I don't know me, because if I don't know, then you can't know. And then like, how are we connecting? Right? Like,
Right.
what are we connecting around? And so I love that reminder of like coming into ourselves first is really actually the way in which we move closer to others.
Yeah.
And also discern who are the others we want to be close to, right? Like how
Right. That
close to certain
discernment.
people. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And so that brings us back to this phrase of yours. And I'm going to keep using it because I'm like loving the way it sounds coming out of my mouth and just feeling into it. Right. But that therapy is not a dirty word. And therapy is that space where you get to know you.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which makes me then think about family of origin stuff, because like this is one of the things that I geek out on all the time, right? But so much of the time, the deeper I get into this work, the more I study it, the longer I've been a therapist, the more I understand that for so many of us, for whatever reason, and I really have a lot of respect for our ancestors and believe that I really believe every one of them in many ways tried to do the best they could. And still,
Right.
there's this intergenerational transmission of trauma that gets passed down from generation to generation. And many of us grow up in homes where we don't really get to know ourselves. We spend our childhoods trying in many ways to orient ourselves around keeping a family system stable and safe and
Mhm.
taking care of the grown-ups in our lives.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's interesting. It makes me think about, I have lots of thoughts about sort of the
Bring it.
intergenerational trauma and all of those
Yeah.
things, but it actually it brings me to this space of I was having a conversation. I was actually having a conversation with my son. I have adult children, young baby adults, I like to call them. But
I'll
we were
always be
talking
your
about
baby. They can't outgrow that.
they can't. Also, they like barely want to be full on adults, so it works out for them. But we were talking about sort of therapy and like and just growth in general. And I was saying, sometimes the hardest work in therapy is actually cultivating a relationship where it feels gentle,
Mm-hmm.
right? Where it isn't about taking care of your therapist. It isn't about tough love or
Right.
pointing out all the negative. It's about being in a space where someone says, "Tell me more about you. Let's get to know you and like all these parts of who you are at your core." Like coming back to that place, and that is so often, I think, sometimes the hardest work that we do because, and I think in part because of what you just said,
Yeah.
so much of childhood, which in theory is the time when we do that, is when we're
Mhm.
sort of most, I don't want to say authentically, but sort of most oriented to like our own wants and needs and desires and
Yeah.
like perspective of the world. But
It's developmentally appropriate. Like that's what we're supposed to be doing in childhood.
we're supposed to be self-absorbed.
Yeah.
And yet, because despite their best efforts, so many parents, grandparents, I mean, generation after generation showed up with so much stuff that they were trying to heal, that childhood often becomes this place of how do I play into this dynamic that keeps things safe for as many of us as possible?
Yeah.
For me, and then as many of us as possible, right? Like I kind of have to. And so it becomes foreign to reach adulthood and finally have the room and the space. That's terrifying because part of what we learned in childhood is it's not safe to be focused on our own needs and wants and who we are in the world.
Right. That's selfish, right?
Right.
No, I mean, it isn't, but it's what we're told.
But that's what it's what we're told. And and I think that's such an interesting question sometimes for us to reflect on is what's the cost of self? If we think of that as being selfish, what would being selfish cost you when you were a child? What would that have meant?
I love thinking about it in this way. Like, what is the cost of that?
Yeah.
It changes the weight, right? Like, because now we can bring back in that there was a cost.
Yeah.
Right. And when I can name that there was a cost, that opens some expansiveness for some more compassion. Like, well, what if I am looking for what that cost was, like what was maybe missed?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And I know it's hard sometimes to do, but holding that space, because I think often we don't want to people try not to vilify parents and other caregivers and ancestors, and being able to say, but there was a cost to all of us.
Yeah.
And we don't have to go quite to a place of blame. We can just understand it and then be like, and now what does it cost us now? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Now at this place in my life, I did it because it made sense then. Right. And
one of my mentors, Terry Real, he'll often say things like adaptive then, maladaptive now.
Yeah.
Right. So it was something that we needed back then. And now less so. And I think when I look at who's coming into my practice and who's really digging into this work, I'm noticing a theme that I have people of all different age ranges and orientations. And yet I noticed that middle-aged folks who are coming to this work, often when they're launching their children into the world, come into this work really differently and with a different degree of, well, they have different amount of different life experience to reflect on. Right.
Yeah.
And so they come into the work in a really different place than someone who's, say, in their like 20s or 30s.
Yeah. I think that's really true. And it's, and that I think at least in my experience, I think they also bring a certain amount of grief that's different than in your 20s and 30s, because it is about, it's not just about childhood and like what happened then, but it's, you have a life, like a substantial chunk of life that you look back on and you're beginning to sort of see and unravel and go like, oh, look at the places where I compromised who I really was because I thought I had to, right? Like, for good reason. But like, I think I'm finding that there's a lot of grief work that grows alongside of this, of being able to learn to have a deep compassion for your 20 and 30-year-old self and going, she did what she knew how to do because that's what she understood. And as you start to unpack that, I think that there's we try to be really conscientious of that, of really honoring like those versions, the early versions of ourselves, right? Who peeling back these layers and unraveling things and thinking about doing it differently, that we also have to grieve because you start to see those old experiences through a new lens where you're like, oh, I could have done that differently. I could have had a very different experience.
Yeah.
And there's some pain in that, you know?
I think that grief is so important to sit with, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I do believe it's the entry point for compassion in a lot of different ways, and especially towards the self and in relationship with other. That grief is often a bridge, it connects us.
Mm-hmm.
My microphone's falling on my face.
Microphone's like, oh, the grief.
Grief of that. So this laughter that we're sharing right now is not necessarily about grief. It's about the shared moment. And yeah, the grief is like an important piece of the puzzle. And so often we're oriented towards, I mean, how much of our society actually sits with grief?
Yeah.
Right? Actually sits with accountability.
Mm-hmm. Great. It's not very often.
Yeah.
I think that's part of what has been hard for people, for many over this year is, and I want to be really clear, like, I think that ritual and tradition is incredibly important, particularly around things like grief, and like, it's an important way that we process that in a collective experience. But I think we've also now had a year of having to face, like, we don't get to distract ourselves in the same way with busyness. And I think that has become in our culture, societally, like a way of moving through grief, getting
Distraction.
Distraction. And like, I can be, I sent flowers and I wrote a card and I baked a casserole and, we've grieved and it's over. Or, I posted a thing and, we had a meeting and so we've done accountability and we're done. And so the increased or the slower pace of this year and the increased amount of time that many people have had being just with themselves or, with a much smaller group kind of forces us to sit with those things. And I won't say force. It's been a bolder invitation for us to sit with some things that are often harder to sit with. We don't have as much experience sitting with. But it's important,
And I think that taps into the growth edge, right? Because when we don't have the experience, it feels really awkward, uncomfortable, right? We get sometimes judgy about that awkwardness right? And so we kind of want to we want to do something else because that awkwardness is something that's difficult for folks, not having the experience, not having it like in our bones, not knowing what does it feel like to sit in this kind of space and expand into this new dimension.
Mm-hmm. It's funny because it is one of the things that I think we also miss about being able to sit with like elders and that over time, and I mean like over generations and generations, we've moved from this place of having more shared stories. Because I think that was one of the ways that we learned how to do that, to have that. Like I always love the imagery of like feeling it in your bones. Like I know how to do this. I think for a long time that came from being in a large enough sort of family collective that there was somebody who would do that and model that or be with you in that, so that you then have that to pass on to someone else. And for a lot of reasons, it's like a whole other podcast conversation.
That's a whole nother thing. And we can allude to it.
And we've gotten to a place where we don't do that as much. But we can, it makes me sad that we don't, but it is also a reminder to me, like, I think that's very human.
Yeah.
It's a very human experience. And so we can, if we, if we're given the space and kind of do a little digging around for the courage to do that. And I guess kind of comes full circle to me around the, like, another reason therapy is not a dirty word. To me is therapy is a space of saying, like, come and be your full, messy human self.
Yes.
And here is another human being who wants to sit with you in that.
who wants to sit with you in that, who wants to just feel the resonance with you.
Yeah.
And I think this is also something that I've heard you talking about, who is also human, right? Who's also just on a journey.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I feel as a therapist, I feel very passionate about the just moving away as much as possible from the idea of like therapists as superheroes and gurus and there is we can't pretend that there is not a power dynamic to the work that we do.
Oh my
There is
God,
a
there
power.
is. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a very clear power dynamic inside of sessions, but that we are still human, and that is this is from my work. Like, I think some days that's the most powerful thing that I have to offer my clients is that I know all of these things and I've done all this training and I have these skills, and I still show up as a human being who has all of their own stuff.
Right.
Now, my stuff is not fodder for our hour together, but that I'm being here with you, not sort of sitting on high, observing or analyzing, but I want to sit with you in your process.
The with you part.
Yeah.
Right. That is like, oh, that's the healing experience right there.
Yeah.
That I want to sit with you. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it brings me back to kind of what we're missing out on, as we were alluding to before, like, I have had the privilege and the opportunity to study with Dr. Clarissa Pinkola Estes. And one of the things I love about studying with her is that there's like 100 of us kind of sitting at her feet and listening to story from an elder, And so that's like, kind of like a pilgrimage that I take in my own learnings. And it's a place where I have learned so much about what we've missed out on by not having those kinds of spaces. And so as you were talking before, one of the things that I thought about is I caught myself thinking of the word capitalism. Like, this is part of what has taken away those spaces for so many of us. And has put us into these dynamics of power over versus power with. That is really what therapy in an ideal situation can move us back towards, right? Because it's the sitting together with again. It's the being in resonance. And that's really it. It's the being in resonance.
It is.
Yeah.
It is. It is. I love the imagery. You made me think of, gosh, it's been a long time, but years ago, I was in a peer supervision group. And it was 4 of us, all roughly the same age. And then Joan, who was this amazing therapist. I mean, at the time, I feel like Joan was probably in her 60s or 70s, but she's been doing this for so long. And yes, she knew lots of things and there's lots of training and all of that. But going to that group once or twice a month felt like, I used to joke, I love Little Women, the book. And so I was like, every time I'm here, it reminds me of like the image of like the March girls sitting at their mother's feet in front of this fire, and that experience. And like, but we miss that. And I absolutely agree with you that there is capitalism, and we really can get into, I think capitalism, certainly in America, is also tied very much into kind of white supremacy and like all of these, and those systems work by creating power over
dynamics instead of shared power, instead of we are in this together.
I think it functions in a way, and for me, like that power over dynamic is in part about that there has to be a group that is dehumanized.
Yes.
Right? Because somebody has to sort of become the like commodity, the resource, the tool. And that dehumanizing, even if we don't see it so overtly, it keeps us apart. The thing that we as human beings long for the most.
The connection.
We are in the system that by its very design is about keeping at least some of us disconnected.
And I think it seeps even into our familial relationships.
Yeah.
Right? Like we learn because we're living inside of this ecosystem, right? We're all breathing this air.
Yeah.
And so we learn that like we do it to each other. We do it to the people we love the most.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. I mean, I absolutely, and I've had some conversations with folks around, we see it a lot, and there's some interesting conversations around it in terms of race and like
Yeah.
the value in the same breath as kind of like trying to dismantle a system, right? And do anti-racism work,
Mm-hmm.
having to constantly come back to, but like our values, our milestones of what it means to be successful, to grow, still being directed by
The
the
system that we live
system,
inside of.
the system that we live inside of, which is also the system that we're trying to like redesign or dismantle. And that's such a complex place to be of it. And it really does require, I think, going back to what you were talking about of learning how to be in resonance with people.
Yeah.
And that is in fact it's a scary, it's a vulnerable place.
Oh my gosh, it's so vulnerable.
Yeah.
I think it was almost 2 years ago now that I had the opportunity to sit with and interview Resma Menachem, kind of like we're talking right now.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm talking about being in resonance and sitting with how all of these powerful power dynamics and racial pieces sit inside of our souls and our beings and being able to talk with others. That was about 2 years ago. And it's just like this summer that I'm finally starting my group with local practitioners who are ready to do the work. It's taken 2 years from that seed being planted to now where I actually have a group ready to start doing that deep inner work.
Yeah. And it's interesting because, like, as you're saying that, I'm like, but that stuff takes time,
It
right?
does.
And patience. And then I sort of circle back to the whole like, but capitalism is not about that, right?
It's not right. And so when we start talking about and therapy takes time and patience, right?
Mhm.
And like so these are the parts of like what I've made up this word. I think it's a hard one for me to like literally get out of my mouth sometimes, but it's like a combination of a few different words. So the word witness, right? Like so when
Mhm.
we're witnessing something, but now it's withness. It
Got
always
it.
kind of comes out a little funny, right? But so I think that this witnessing, like if we are with ourselves, if we are in resonance with and with our therapist or our therapist is with us in that way, this is the thing that in so many ways I think can really like just heal through like, ripple through an ecosystem and really do a lot of healing. But it's the thing that is so devalued in so many ways because it's that like it's the being, not the doing.
Yeah. It's exactly that. It's so much of that. And like we are in a system that values productivity,
Yes.
efficiency, busyness, doing of things. And so to say like, so the things that you're struggling with are going to be better by simply being. Like, we're just going to be together for, I don't know, 6 months, a year, maybe 2 years. We're just going to be. Like, that sounds, in the context of, the system we live in, that sounds crazy. Like, what? No. What a waste of time. What a waste of money. And yet, it is exactly what we all are longing for the most. Like, people talk about sort of healing these things. And I think we're still so much in a struggle of going, oh, but healing takes time and it's just, and witness.
Yeah.
And witness doesn't look like much.
It doesn't sometimes look like anything at all.
Right. Yeah.
There's no way to like put a value on it and to say this is what it's worth.
right. Until you've done it for a while and then you're like, well, it changed my life.
Yeah.
You're like, no, I don't like, I can't imagine living the way I used to live or relating to people the way I used to relate. And it's not because you moved to some magical, perfect utopian way of being. It's just, you're like, oh, this is what it's like to be my whole self in my life. That's amazing.
This
That's
is what
the
it's
point.
like to be my whole self in my life.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so there's a value to being wholly who
Mhm.
you are.
Yeah.
But it's not a value that anybody could put on something or that anyone could explain to you. It's just one that, like, let's go back to that. You have to feel in your bones.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And sometimes I just hope I'm like, oh, I think almost by accident, many of us have that experience just periodically in life, right? Like you do a thing, you listen to a song, I don't know, you meet somebody and you click and like they're your new best friend or
Yeah.
romantic partner, or you get even sometimes it's at work, right? Like you start to do something and you find this passion around this a sense of purpose and what's happening. Like we get these moments of it even without trying, but we don't know how to name it. And then we don't know
Mhm.
how to go back. Like, oh, but the idea that you could have that experience at like in your whole life as like a complete way of being, not these sort of magic moments, I think is hard to wrap our heads around sometimes.
Yeah. Well, I think it's hard to wrap our heads around until
Mhm.
we have entered into it. It's like a whole new dimension,
Mhm.
right? And that, like, if we go backwards a little bit in our conversation, that's the invitation, right? That's the space. Like when I learn enough about what my value is, when you learn enough about what your value is, it's from that place that we can make an invitation to sit with and get to know each other,
Yeah.
right? And the boundary then that we start learning about is one that protects that value, protects the value in me and protects the value in you.
Mhm. Yeah. I love that.
Me
Thinking
too.
about it from that place of, yeah, if that's the, and it feels like a subtle shift of, before we were recording, we were talking about that feeling of needing to take care of people.
Mm-hmm.
And that shift of like, no, it's not about protecting you or fixing you or taking care of you, but the value in you, right? Like that,
Yes.
how can I honor that in you and in me? And
Yes.
that becomes a different thing. And not so, again, back to that sense of doing.
Right.
Yeah.
I keep getting curious because there's a bit of a dreamer in me about what this world could be like if we all were oriented more towards that.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, like, it feels like it's a reach. Yes.
It feels
And
magical.
it does.
Yes.
And I think you and I have both seen people shifting in our own offices, in our own selves, in our own relationships. We have borne witness to the possibility of, on small numbers, we're not talking like the whole worldwide population, but
Yeah. Yeah.
with the people that come to us, um, I think we've both seen some shifts.
I
So it
think
doesn't feel impossible, but I don't know.
it doesn't, it's as you talk about it, and I think about one of the things that I have actually struggled with this year is like, I think optimist is probably, if you ask almost anybody who knows me, that's got to be like top three adjectives. And this has been a year for me of really struggling with that. Like
Yeah.
it's something that I think has been so integral to like my own sense of identity.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, oh, I have a hard time dreaming. But what
Yeah.
it has also reminded me of is so much of what we've been talking about,
Mm-hmm.
being able to sit with other people.
Yeah.
That has been the place that, because as you said, like I've seen it, I've watched, like, I mean, humans are amazing. People are just like, oh, isn't it like, does it burn you out? Don't you get depressed? I'm like, no, because that moment where you see somebody grow from something, heal from something, change their way of being with a partner is amazing.
Yeah.
But also being with other people who, because we all are able to hold that hope and optimism and dream about the possibilities of like the world being different, of people being different, that ebbs and flows.
It
And so
definitely does.
it's just another value and like of being able to be in, as you said, like in resonance with and sitting with others is, so it's okay for me to feel slightly less optimistic than I'm used to, because I've also figured out how to cultivate a circle of people, of relationships that allow me to just be with them. And in being with them, being really reconnected to like a part of myself. And I think that's another piece of it. That's another piece of like the value, the gift of that process.
I love the part where you said, because of the people that the group of people that you've cultivated, right? That's the part that also allows, like, there's a discernment in there. I feel a very gentle intention, right? Around who you call into that group, who you surround yourself with.
Yeah.
That allows you to be.
Yeah. And it's something, I mean, I encourage so many people, clients and friends and family, like it is an intention that and again, it comes back to what we, we're talking about earlier of the first, it's about being with yourself.
Yeah.
Because that's part of what allows you to have the discernment for like, oh, who are the people that I need to kind of become close, right? Like call closer to me so we can be together. Like that's what cultivating it looks like. I can't, if you think of it, it's like cultivating land. Like if I don't know what I'm trying to plant and I don't know the conditions in which it, does it need acidic soil and lots of sun, low sun, like how much water? Like if I don't know those things, I can't really cultivate much of anything. You just sort of get what you get. And sometimes you get something great, but like there's no real intention behind it, versus that like kind of getting to know yourself is about saying like, oh, this is what I want to cultivate in my life. And this is what I need to be able to do that. And so then you get to ask different things, different questions, and discern different things of the people you spend your time with. And not just people, content too.
Yeah. And I think this is that layered approach, right? That you're also talking about, because as you're giving this example of the garden, I'm like, oh, that was my garden last year. This year it's going to be different because, right? What I learned then was, and these things don't go well with each other. I need to plant this before I plant that. And so I'm just kind of thinking into what my experience was gardening last year and what I'm already shifting and doing differently this year. Those are like the nuances and the layers that we're talking about. And even in terms of getting to know ourselves, you like extrapolating that example into these aspects of our self-tending. Yeah.
I love that, self-tending, because, we talk a lot of, there's part of me, I'm like, I love that self-care is so trendy right now on the one hand, and on the other hand, I'm like, oh, but there's layers. There's so many layers.
Yeah.
Often I'll be like self-nurturing, but I like self-tending.
I caught myself. I didn't want to say self-care.
Yeah. I'm like, self-care is a piece of a much bigger pool of things that we need in order to nurture, to tend to ourselves.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Esther, I have loved this conversation. I would love to stay in conversation with you. And I also want to value your time and our listeners' time. And so I'm wondering if you could share with our listeners where they could find more about you.
Absolutely. So you can find, as you said at the beginning, I do lots of things. So the easiest, like kind of like ground, like launching pad is estherboykin.com. So that's my website. From there, you can get information about my group practice, which is based in like the DC metro area. That's Group Therapy Associates. And you can also link to Therapy is Not a Dirty Word, where we host happy hours and dinners.
So much.
Retreats and podcasts, and you can buy cute little tote bags. There's a lot happening there. And then
your Instagram account.
And my Instagram account, which I always like to tell you can find me on all the social media at Esther B MFT, but I am definitely most active and responsive on Instagram. So I would love it if people want to follow me there and connect. I try to get on live and have a lot of conversation on Instagram as well.
Yeah. Thank you again so much for joining us here today. On the Connect on this Practice podcast. I have loved this conversation, and I feel like we can go so much deeper.
Yeah. Thank you so much. This has been lovely. It has been such a joy to be with you today, right? And be in connection with each other.
Yeah, I really enjoyed being with you too.
Thank you.
I hope that you got a lot out of listening today. You know, when I reflect back on what I got out of this episode, I think the thing that impresses me the most, well, there's multiple pieces, but one of the things that impresses me the most from this conversation is the gentleness. And I just want to point that out because I think that gentleness is really one of these big pieces here. When we're doing this deep work and we're exploring our own healing journey, so often what we come across are these like implicit ways of even judging ourselves, judging our own process. And the really cool kind of like nerdy piece that I just want to share with you here is that like judgment and curiosity don't coexist. Like they use the same part of our brain. So we kind of have to make a choice between this or that, between judgment or curiosity. And the more often that you can lean towards that curiousness, the more space you make for yourself, the more of that gentle relationship and that you start to cultivate. And so if this episode really reached you, then I encourage you to lean in a little bit more towards that curiosity. I think you'll find that to be really effective. And with that, I want to just make note that I have another episode coming out in about two-ish weeks. And after that, I will be taking a break and restore and replenish a little bit for me because I need to. And then I'll be back with season 3 probably in late September. So I hope that you are well. I hope that you're taking care of yourself. And I hope that you're cultivating safe, gentle spaces for your own journey. Oh, and before I go, hop on over to the Why Does My Partner podcast. My colleagues Jules, Vicky, and I have been creating some amazing content over there as well. I would love for you to check that podcast out too. And then I'll be back and I'll see you again here soon. You can learn more about my Connectfulness counseling practice and my online workshops at connectfulness.com. And if you haven't already, check out the new podcast that I'm co-hosting called Why Does My Partner? We'd love for you to hop on over, give us a listen, and send us listener questions over at whydoesmypartner.com. I want to express my deep gratitude for Sarah and Chris Ferris, the musicians behind the beautiful soundtrack for the Connectfulness Practice podcast, which they recorded and mixed at Kidney Stone Studio. And more gratitude for Little Green Art House for all of our post-production needs. This podcast is produced by me, Rebecca Wong, and copyrighted by Connectfulness Counseling. Take good care and be well.